Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to our speakers and participants, wherever you're joining from. I see people are being let in, so maybe let me give it 2 minutes to allow for our colleagues to join from various parts before we get into this really insightful discussion today. I warmly welcome you to this online event, which is co-organized by the European Centre for Development Policy, best known to most of you as ECDPM, together with the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance, which is a dialogue on how AfCFTA regulations can support continental trade. My name is Philomena Pico, better known to some of you as Auntie Philo. I'm a policy officer at the ECDPM, and I'll be moderating our discussions today. So before we hear from our speakers, I wanted to remind you of some house rules. Please mute yourself as you join to allow for minimal disturbance. You'll be able to unmute during the Q&A because we want to, of course, keep this as engageful as possible. Do use the chat button if you have some thoughts, questions, insights while the speakers are presenting. And my colleague, Ina Perova, is monitoring this. Just to let you know that the event is being recorded and will be shared on our ECDPM website. And as well, we'd appreciate if you could keep your cameras off because of the bandwidth to allow for a smooth connection. Yeah, so let's keep this an engaging space with respect for the house rules. Once again, I welcome you all to this dialogue. As you may be aware, with the commencement of trading under the AfCFTA in 2021, the attention is now moving from negotiation to implementation. And of course, the focus is always on expanding intra-African trade towards the Africa we want vision. This is in turn raising questions about mandates, about roles, responsibilities, and relations among key stakeholders in relation to the implementation of this continental flagship, the AfCFTA. And this we have seen discussions among, for example, the different institutions, be it the AfCFTA Secretariat, the regional economic communities, and the AU Commission, as well as different regional trade arrangements that exist on the continent. And so today we are really trying to unpack some of this to say, given this commitment to have this flagship program implemented, how can the AfCFTA, how can the RECs, how can different regional trading agreements work together to ensure that we actually are able to implement this? What are some of the discussions that are ongoing? What is being done? What is the perspective from the RECs and the AfCFTA? So today, joining me is a group of brilliant minds, illustrious speakers. I'm sure most of you are familiar with them. But if not, my colleague Ina will put the full bios, as I want to keep this short, and will introduce them by their formal titles. The run of this event today will start with a presentation by my colleague Bruce Byers, who is Associate Director at ECDPM, and he leads the Sustainable and Inclusive Economic Development Cluster. Most of you may be familiar with Bruce's work. He has written a lot about the political economic dynamics of regional integration in Africa, as well as well known for his work on corridors. So we're really grateful to have his insights today. After that, I'll introduce the next speaker and as we go along. So once again, let's keep this engaging. I'm Auntie Philo here for you. So please, if you have any thoughts, please do feel free to use the chat button in the meantime. Bruce, the floor is yours. You're muted.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks very much, Philo, and I hope everybody can see my slides. Yes, thumbs up if you can see them. Yes. So thanks very much for joining this discussion. As Philomena said, the idea here is to try and sort of come up with a way to navigate the AfCFTA regional relations. So what we've been doing is trying to understand a little bit how to move, as ECDPM we say, from policy to practice. And in this case, looking at one of these key sort of phrases that we hear all the time around the AfCFTA, which is the bottom line of my slide here, that the RECs are the building blocks of the AfCFTA. So that's a bit the starting point that we have here. So we've made progress with the agreement, and I think what we want to do is to make today's discussion a kind of a positive discussion in terms of a lot of progress has been made since the agreement was signed in 2018. There are the beginnings of trade taking place, but it's still sort of, as I was just saying to some of the colleagues, there's a process of sort of continental change management, which basically still needs to roll out. And in fact, a lot of the questions that we hear in the discussions about implementation are to do with roles and responsibilities. So that was why this paper that we did in collaboration with Philomena and also Faisal, who's going to speak later from Mandela School, the paper was really to try and understand, okay, what can we say about these AfCFTA regional relations beyond this building block story in terms of what's there on paper, but also in terms of in practice. Sort of how are these things playing out in practice, and therefore what does that mean for policymakers and for their partners? And if everyone could keep their microphones muted, that would be good. If somebody could. Mika, please, Mika, you're unmuted.
Mika, please mute yourself. Thank you.
So the first thing to dive into then is to try and see that these regional relations on paper, what is it that's actually written in the AfCFTA agreement, which is in a way what has led to many of the discussions that we hear around in terms of the challenges. So Article 5 is perhaps the principal one, where it says the AfCFTA shall be governed by the following principles. And within them, it's driven by the member states with the REC free trade areas as building blocks, with preservation of the acquis and using best practices from the RECs. So already what's interesting there is sort of this building blocks part is already there, which suggests that these will remain and these will retain the sort of governance of trade within them, and that there will be some lesson learning from the RECs. Now, what then comes added in Article 19 is that those who are members of other RECs, regional trade arrangements, customs unions, who have higher levels of regional integration than under the AfCFTA agreement shall retain such trade. So this is a bit where this sort of the starting point of the building blocks come from. And I think the main point perhaps for some people who at the beginning assumed there was one unified AfCFTA continental free trade area which was going to emerge. In fact, what we see is it's a network of trade agreements between existing RECs. But even there, the fact that we talk about the RECs, the regional economic communities, introduces some ambiguities. So what we tried to do here was to say, well, if we take those articles between Article 5b about having an FTA, then this would include the EAC, East African Community, the Central African Community, the ECOWAS, COMESA, and SADC. And of the 8 RECs, of course, you know that the African Union recognizes 8 RECs, the AMU, IGAD, and CENSA do not have FTAs. So in this sense, we're already saying, well, yes, the RECs are building blocks, but in a way, 5 of them are considered formally building blocks in terms of having their own FTA, which would, in principle, would, and I say would, exclude the other 3. If we then talk about the higher level of integration, i.e. those that have gone beyond the commitments which are in the AfCFTA, then in fact this brings us down of the 8 RECs to just the EAC and ECOWAS, even though ECAS is seeking to create a customs union. COMESA and SADC had that on their agendas, but they're sort of at FTA level. It arguably creates a difference then between even that group of 5 RECs. The EAC, ECOWAS is clearly in a different category than from the other RECs. But also what this argument sort of brings in, these other regional trade agreements, which have gone further than the AfCFTA, that it brings in SACU and CEMAC, which are then sort of sub-REC regional agreements. So in a way, if we were to take a sort of very narrow look at the wording just from the AfCFTA agreement, arguably the core regional organizations that have a role as building blocks would be EAC, ECOWAS, SACU, and CEMAC. So that already kind of begins to raise some questions and some sensitivities among those working in and sort of engaged through other regional organizations. But what becomes interesting is that once you go beyond the AfCFTA agreement to the other protocols and annexes, you begin to discover a whole range, in fact, of regional relation levels. So I'm going to go into those kind of briefly in a second. But just to give you an overview, the 7 levels then, and these are in a way a kind of a spectrum going from the top, which would be sort of full unification. So in a way, as I said, that some expectations of the AfCFTA were that this was going to be one unified FTA. And in fact, sort of when we look into the different parts of the agreement, you're going to see that that this is actually only sort of visible in one or two places. One level down then is more that actually instead of just having one unified system, is trying to harmonize between the different blocks. So it'd be trying to find ways for these to kind of speak to each other. Complementarity then is almost one level down, where they're not necessarily harmonized, but there are enough agreements between them to make these things work. And arguably, when we talk about the agreement in trade in goods, for example, this is around complementarity. So what I was just discussing just now about the customs unions and the FTAs, SADC FTA will continue to govern trade within SADC, and the agreements or the negotiations are in a way between how those countries would then trade outside SADC. So for example, with ECOWAS. Now, when we look into some of the other protocols in the annexes, there's also sort of a level below this complementarity is around subsidiarity. So there, the point is that, for example, on non-tariff barriers, the way it's worded is if they cannot be solved at a national level, they should be raised to the regional level. And if at the regional level they cannot be solved, they should be raised to the continental level. And there's a continental NTB reporting mechanism which has been created. So you can see that there's these different levels which basically get sort of looser the more that we go down from 1 to 7. So underneath subsidiarity is more just a kind of a desire for coordination. So they should, regional and AfCFTA bodies should coordinate, but basically coexist. Then there's cooperation, which means they don't really need to coordinate exactly what's happening, but still make sure that they work together. And then the final one is peer learning. So it's more sort of building on what each other is doing. So you can see this is a kind of a 7 different levels. And when we talk about building blocks, in fact, within that building block argument, there are actually very different types that we're talking about. So I'm not going to go into detail on this, but all I wanted to show was if we take that for the AfCFTA agreement, the protocols, the annexes, in fact, what we see that this idea of unification, for example, sort of the top level, if you like, we only really see it appearing in the text in the agreement, where there was this ambition to resolve the challenges of multiple and overlapping memberships, which at some point had created some sensitivities amongst some of the REC and regional organization representatives. And the other only place where it appears is, in fact, in the protocol on investment, where there's a discussion of coming to alignment from the RECs with the AfCFTA protocol. So it's one where the idea is that the protocol should actually come to shape what's being used at the regional level going down. And that, of course, then is different to the complementarity argument. So as we said in the AfCFTA agreement, the broad agreement, it talks about the building blocks, that's the complementarity angle. That seems to be what's really driving the protocol on trade in goods. And as I mentioned, when we talk to NTBs, this is more actually about subsidiarity with some references also to coordination. And what's interesting also is that we see peer learning appearing in the broad agreement, and this is sort of about building on best practices. But also when we look specifically at trade and services, there's a whole point about trying to build on and learn from best practices and a key from the RECs. So here, this is sort of the further protocols, competition, digital trade, intellectual property, women and youth. And what you can see is that as we go through, there's more sort of a bit of harmonization on women and youth. But in fact, the levels of coordination are very much more to do with coordination, cooperation, and peer learning, which appear very frequently amongst these latter ones. So that's a bit, we'll come back to that at the end in terms of what are the implications of that. But the main point would be, depending on which level is actually foreseen, this is going to have implications in a way about who should be driving it and how this should take place. And that becomes interesting if we start sort of taking that on paper. So what we've just looked at is going through all the texts and contrast that with what there is in practice. And this, when we were doing this work, then it was building on multiple interviews with people who were operating sort of across the different range of actors at the REC level, at CFTA level, at the AUC level. And what we began to see was that there were sort of 4 different visions, in a way, in people's minds, sort of mental images, let's say, of how the AfCFTA should be operating. On one hand, we call this the new dawn, and in a way, this was sort of saying this is the AfCFTA is the new continental agenda, And the way that certain people see it, therefore, is that it's responding to sort of failures of the Abuja Treaty, which sort of is what sort of created the idea of the RECs in a continental market. It's above the RECs, so the idea is that sort of in this line, it's almost a bit the sort of the unification level. This idea that the AfCFTA should be sort of what's the word, superior or above the RECs. There's a second level, though, and because the AfCFTA Secretariat is autonomous to the African Union, but sort of emerged from the African Union and the whole African Union process, and of course still responds to the Summit of Ministers, there's a sense that, in fact, the AUC, for some, the Commission has been sort of losing a role which it should have retained in terms of coordinating AfCFTA and the RECs. That these are all actually actors who are supposed to be implementing the same agenda, and therefore the drive should be coming more from the AUC level. And of course, this is also slightly contested from certain people from the RECs, because in many ways the RECs have got longer experience in terms of promoting regional integration, generally have have closer levels of integration, as we saw with the customs unions. So arguably, again, sort of in inverted commas, should have a key role to play, and could, for some, be sort of the intermediary, play an intermediary role between the Secretariat and the member states. And of course, all of this is to, in a way, not ignore the fourth point, which is when it comes to implementation, this is a state-party agreement. So it's the member states, regardless of which customs union or free trade area or whatever they're a member of, ultimately implementation has to take place at the state level. Now, the point is not to say that it's one or the other here, but what was interesting in the interviews was that the entry point that people had into the AfCFTA and how AfCFTA regional relations should be shaped, in some respects, differed according to their take on these different four levels. And of course, nobody was saying that sort of the other was irrelevant, but the point was that it actually varied depending on the issue. So we tried to go into this in a bit more detail, just in terms of some specific areas. One, in terms of negotiations, of course, those countries that were members of customs unions had to coordinate. So SACU, sort of by necessity, played an intermediary role, which is slightly different to what ECOWAS managed to do, where although a customs union simply managed to coordinate, but of course that was quite different to the role of, for example, the SADC Secretariat, which in a way was sort of more an observer, as was formally seen, and didn't have this coordinating role. At the same time, as I said, going through the different protocols, these things have varied. And in fact, COMESA, while a free trade area and not playing a key role in terms of negotiations of trade in goods, reportedly did have a strong role to play in negotiation of the competition protocol, because the COMESA Competition Authority is quite a sort of well-established body and actually generates resources. So part of the sort of the understanding that we were looking for was to see who plays what role and why. And I think this sort of illustrates then a bit the different sort of roles that the regional bodies have played according to the different angles. And of course, one of the mechanisms that was set up to try and improve or to try and support the AfCFTA regional relations was these coordination meetings. And this has been interesting, partly because this is in parallel to the AU REC meetings themselves, and in a way provides a forum for this lesson learning, which we talked about above, but a bit where there's been a challenge, according to interviewees, about how to actually make these as useful as they could be. And I think one of the sort of the conclusions that we make at the end is the need to try and be more purposeful in a way about zooming in on specific protocols, specific regions or specific sectors, and seeing how to use these coordination meetings more purposefully. I don't want to go into too much detail here, but I think the point to be made is that there are these other processes around the implementation strategies, which are mostly being done at the national level, but of course also at the REC level. Maybe we'll hear from Annette from the EAC side how they're managing that, which of course then also has sort of implications for where member states see common interests about implementing the AfCFTA agenda through the regional structures. And of course, more and more what we hear about is trying to promote implementation through corridors and trade facilitation. So there's a lot of discussion about the Abidjan-Lagos corridor, where I know Trademark and Alain have been working. And of course, there's discussions about how to use, perhaps, to make the AfCFTA sort of function in practice is actually to look at specific regional value chains. And there, the more you look at regional value chains, of course, the more multi-actor it becomes again as well. And we have sort of the AUC is sort of hosts the IDA, the African Industrialization Development Action Plan. So again, it sort of raises the issue of potential overlaps in mandates, but that can also be flipped around to say potential combinations of forces which could help lead in implementation. So just I've got 3 last slides just to kind of say what can we draw from this and what can we use to try and make this a kind of a constructive discussion. And I think the first perhaps is, as we said, the starting point, and we cite it many times because this was almost the first phrase that everybody that we talked to raised. The RECs are the building blocks of the AfCFTA. But hopefully what we've seen here is that if you go into the texts, in a way that phrase isn't that helpful. In a way it's a bit too broad and kind of rides over the fact that in fact, each protocol, each annex has its own specific way of shaping how these relationships could take place, and in a way has implications for who could or should lead on it. I think what it also shows is there's a need to think about different institutional options. So at the moment, in a way, the burden with very limited or relatively limited resources is on the AfCFTA Secretariat. But would there be ways, for example, of thinking of some of the REC secretariats or some of their departments, sort of the Trade Department, Customs Union, serving as some kind of liaison or subsecretariat of the AfCFTA Secretariat? Could we be thinking about some kind of having staff from the secretariats seconded to RECs? Could we be thinking about some regional poles, a bit like what we see in some of the regions? The AAC, of course, most of the countries have a Ministry of East African Affairs. I think that might be a bit too much for the AfCFTA, but I think in terms of trying to manage these relations, that would be sort of an idea, would be to have something there. And of course, ultimately, the question always comes back a bit to resources. From discussions, the people sitting in the regional bodies already have a very full agenda for promoting their regional agenda. And in a way, the AfCFTA comes as an additional task without additional resources. And at the same time, the AfCFTA Secretariat is sitting with an enormous implementation agenda to try and push this with the state parties, but with limited resources to do it. So again, this kind of links to that institutional point about, in fact, if there's limited financial resources, is it a way to use and join up the human resources? To do that, then, one of the conclusions also, and maybe Faisal can say more about this, was about the need actually from the Secretariat side to help discuss implementation priorities. Of course, the member states need to be at the center of this. And I think what we wanted to do by the end was really push on this line of thinking about implementation as a bottom-up process, about taking each annex and protocol sort of one by one, and start thinking about sort of what is needed for implementation to take place. Now, this last one, then I'm going to close, was just to say if we go back to our levels of integration, which we sort of drew from the different texts, there are arguably actually quite clear messages about who should be leading on what. And if we think about the unification parts, then this is relatively clear that this should be the Secretariat which is leading, and arguably on harmonization ideas as well, because somebody needs to be helping draw these things together. But the more we move down, in fact, the more the lead, in fact, should potentially be taken or shared with the regional level. So when we go to subsidiarity and coordination, arguably this is where there's more sort of parallel discussions rather than hierarchical. But let me leave that there, because I think we're interested to hear also what our discussants have to say, and I'm aware that time is passing fast. Thank you very much. Back to you, Philomena.
Thanks so much, Bruce. I was just flagging, but you clearly read my mind to say time was up. So Auntie Philo can also be a good timekeeper. So thanks for this. For those of you who may not be aware, we did in September, together with the Mandela School of Public Governance, publish a paper looking at how AfCFTA regional relations can support continental trade. And Bruce's presentation summarizes really well what we found in this study. My colleague Ina will place the link in the chat box so that you can have time to have consideration after this event of this study. So Bruce, you raised a number of issues, and for me, because I've also followed closely the African Union and developments around AU regional integration relations, now AfCFTA-REC relations. A lot of the things that she raised, with these 7 stages of integration are also similar to what is happening at the AU level. So the issues around subsidiarity, the issues around complementarities, those are not new. And perhaps there is a way to even draw lessons from areas like peace and security governance. What has worked, what has not worked? How can this be translated to help with the implementation of the AfCFTA? I did like your point where you raised the issue of the national implementation strategies. And maybe just to share, unfortunately, one of our speakers, Milion Hapte from the AfCFTA Secretariat, is not able to join the discussions because he's not feeling well. However, he was really a person who's been following the discussions around the national implementation committees. So hopefully between the speakers and the audience, we can perhaps talk a bit about this. When Bruce mentioned the issue around peer learning, I think this is one example. If you remember, early in January this year, the AfCFTA Secretariat together with INECA had organized a session around peer learning. So there's already some examples that are being put into play. How can RECs and the AfCFTA learn from each other, to bring about better implementation? But I will stop here for now and maybe give the floor to Faisal to give some additional comments. Faisal was also a co-author of this study. And for those of you not familiar with Faisal, Faisal Ismail is the director of the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance at the University of Cape Town. He's also a member of the AfCFTA Trade and Industrial Development Advisory Council. His expertise is mostly around trade international negotiations, but he has a really wide sphere of work. So we're really thankful that he's joining our discussion today. Faisal, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks, Philomena, for hosting this and facilitating it, and working together with me and Bruce and yourself on this paper. It's been really an interesting journey for us. We learned a great deal by talking to a number of experts across the continent, and indeed we are still learning. There is no easy answer. There's no silver bullet really to the question of the relationship and the roles of the AfCFTA, the Secretariat, and the RECs. And as Bruce correctly said, the RECs are considered to be building blocks, but that is a rather vague concept, because it doesn't really work like a building a Lego. You can't just take the 8 RECs or regional blocks and use them to build upwards towards the AfCFTA. And the reason for this is that the RECs themselves are actually very different animals. They're not all the same, not like a Lego, each block is the same. But in this case, each of the RECs has a different shape. Some are squares, some are triangles, some are, just long structures, because their histories are completely different. And as Bruce was saying, we probably only have 3 customs unions amongst the RECs, and those that profess to become a customs union are now real customs union. So one is the SACU. The SADC wants to be one, but it really is a long way from there. The EAC is pretty close to being a customs union, and so is ECOWAS. The others are in some cases, they have free trade agreements between them, and in some cases they haven't even started on the journey towards free trade. So very different animals. But as Bruce was saying, the levels of integration, there are at least 7 that can be identified. They are very different in their ambition, in the depth, and in the scope to which they contribute to the integration of the African continent. Now, I think that one of the things we need to look at are the the roles that the RECs can play and have been playing, I think in the first instance, the RECs have played a sort of a governance role or legitimacy role. They have been participating in the process of the negotiations as observers. Indeed, they can only be observers because they don't represent the member states. Indeed, they are at the regional level. They coordinate the functions of the various functions of the member states at the regional level, and facilitate the cooperation, coordination, and integration of the sub-regions. But they are not representative. Therefore, they are not. They don't have negotiating authority in the negotiations, but they have been observers, and they have played that role. So they're quite active. But secondly, what the RECs can do, and they have done, is they can play a number of the other roles of the 7 levels of unification, harmonization, and complementarity, subsidiarity, coordination, cooperation, and peer learning. There's quite a few examples where within the RECs, there's quite a high level of engagement and some really good best practices and case studies of integration, including in some cases really good institutions built on competition policy, in other cases on investment cooperation and on trade facilitation. So quite a lot of experience has been built up by the RECs within the RECs themselves that could be of great value to the Secretariat to build on. And then thirdly, of course, in some cases, only 3 cases, the RECs have been negotiators. They have been negotiating as a bloc. So SACU, for example, negotiates as a bloc in the AfCFTA negotiations. Now, I want to maybe just tease out a few other issues related to the cooperation between the AfCFTA Secretariat, the RECs, and the member states. So it seems to me that the question of leadership, who leads various initiatives on the implementation of the AfCFTA, is really a question of capacity and a question of the specific capabilities of each of these different institutions. In some cases, the Secretariat can lead and should lead. It should provide overall guidance on the implementation, for example, of the protocols, the protocol on trade in goods, how, and indeed the guided trade initiative is being led by the Secretariat. In other cases, the RECs could lead. The RECs could lead in areas where they have a lot of experience, like trade facilitation. The EAC, for example, has done a lot of work on trade facilitation and could provide guidance and leadership on trade facilitation and indeed on corridor development. So, and I know that the East African community is helping to share experience with the with ECOWAS on the corridor development in that region. So similarly, in other areas, the RECs could share their experiences and provide guidance, leadership to the whole of the continent. And thirdly, I think where we must also look to is states. Where member states have a lot of capacity, perhaps in areas like SPS or TBT, because these are annexes that must be implemented. And those member states that have a lot of capability because they have well-developed institutions, they could play a role in sharing their experiences and leading some initiatives on the implementation of the AfCFTA. Now, why I think that the implementation of the AfCFTA is not a silver bullet. It's not a simple process. That is because the way in which we conceive of the implementation is one which I call developmental regionalism. And what that means is that the implementation of the AfCFTA is not only about trade liberalization. It's also about the building and implementation of regional industrial value chains, because this is one of the only ways in which we can really build industrial capability and competitiveness across the region. Thirdly, it is also about the building of corridors, that is road, rail, port development, to create the infrastructure for African countries to trade with each other. Because if you don't have the infrastructure, you really can't trade. And a number of these corridors that are now being developed are vital to the implementation of the trade agenda. So the trade agenda has to go hand in hand with the building of the corridors. And fourthly, in my conception of developmental regionalism, I also include governance, the governance of the institutions, good institutions at the national level, which are transparent, which encourage investment, and which build institutions. So we have, for example, the APRM, the African Peer Review Mechanism, which deals with governance. That includes economic governance. And the AfCFTA itself is now considering putting in place a development review mechanism, which will help to support African countries to strengthen their institutions at the national level, and so that they can effectively implement the AfCFTA and its different protocols. So therefore, it's no easy answer. There is no one way to implement, and I really would look forward to different views and insights from the participants about the paper that we've written, and some of your views about how you think we are going to be able to effectively implement the AfCFTA. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Faisal, for this insightful additions to Bruce's presentation, but also really opening up our, discussion around developmental regionalism. I liked how you phrased this, giving these key points about what could be done to really push implementation, be it not just around the value chains corridors, but also the aspect of governance, because we have to really bring that back in to say, how can this be better governed? How can we ensure that there's better coordination with the existing mandate at the REC level, but also towards the continental ambitions to have the AfCFTA implementation? How can we also have a review mechanism in place? And in fact, the AfCFTA agreement itself does provide for this review. So to be sure that it's actually growing according to the changing context on the continent at the moment. I liked also your insights around the depth. We should be looking at it from both ambition and scope. Who is best placed to lead what? And this is why I think I'm very excited to introduce our next speaker who can shed some light, coming from the regional economic communities. I would like to introduce our next speaker, who is Annette Mutawe Semuwemba. She's the Deputy Secretary General for Customs, Trade and Monetary Affairs in the East African Community Secretariat. Annette, given your role in the EAC, how do you firstly balance the mandate that you have as part of the regional economic community, but also the ambitions that are in the various AfCFTA agreement, but also the different protocols? To what degree do you see alignment, for example, with what you want to do at the EAC and what the AfCFTA wants to do? And what can be better done to ensure more coordination and cooperation between the EAC mandates and the AfCFTA implementation as well? Thank you.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you very much, Auntie Philo, for giving me this floor. And thank you very much, Bruce and Faisal, for kicking us off a very interesting conversation, I must say, and a number of perspectives that have been raised already. I will start by expressing how complex these processes are. And these kind of discussions, I think, allow us to chew bit by bit, but also to learn by doing. This is the first time that the RECs and at FCTA level, we've been faced with a situation where there's coordination that has to take place. So again, as the ESC, we're taking this step by step. But beyond the complexity, I also want to emphasize that behind the RECs are partner states or member states. The RECs are secretariat, but they do have partner states and member states that drive their agendas. And behind the member states are protocols. For ESC, there's a treaty that spells out the scope of cooperation across various areas. And I think Faizo did raise this issue on infrastructure, on social sectors, on quite a number of areas of cooperation. This is really, really important and critical. And for the ESC, again, I wish to highlight a number of important considerations. One, by the time the FCTA came into force, 2019, the ESC had been implementing its agenda for many, many years, including a customs union that had started in 2010. That's critical and important because we were already ahead in some of the areas around trade in goods. We were already cooperating on customs. We're already cooperating on trade facilitation and related issues. Secondly, convening power. It's very important to recognize the role of RECs as conveners and helping in implementing, cascading the agenda of the FCTA down through RECs to partner states. Another issue I want to highlight is that we have learned over the years what works. And as part of the 7 issues that were raised on peer learning, we do understand how to move an agenda forward. And with this, I can give an example, for instance, on the customs union and how the ESC adjusted its ways of implementation through the single customs territory that allowed those under the principle of variable geometry that were able to move forward to be able to do so that the rest could come on board. Again, these are areas of peer learning that we could bring to FCTA processes. And of course, Faizo raised governance, to which I would like to add strong political will. It's really, really critical because bringing together political leaders as frequently as possible to discuss, and also through the different policy organs. So while at the AU there are different policy organs, within the RECs we also have our own policy organs, and the extent to which there's alignment between what is being discussed within that agenda as well as what's being discussed within the policy organs at the different levels in the RECs is very, very important. We could have 2 agendas moving at cross purposes, an ESC agenda that is faster or an FCTA agenda that is faster because there's no alignment across the policy organs. And for trade, for instance, we have a sectoral council on trade, industry, finance, and investment. It is our avenue to feed FCTA-related implementation to ensure that alignment. So now I want to move on to these are the different areas that have been identified and what the ESC did, and taking into account the benefit of experience and noting that coordination would be very critical. We did already prepare our own strategy on FCTA implementation. And the ESC emphasis was on 3 aspects. One was on coordination, that to achieve effective implementation of the FCTA, the ESC Secretariat would strive to coordinate activities. And I'm looking at the definition of coordination as Bruce presented, and it did align to what the ESC has tried to do. So coordinate activities of the FCTA by leveraging execution of programs at national level. So we are the conduit, identify what those activities are, coordinate so that at national level, they are being implemented. 2, harmonization. And again, that's one of the areas that were identified. And to achieve effective implementation, the ESC would endeavor to harmonize policies and strategies of partner states with those of the ESC Trade and Regional Integration Agenda, the FCTA, to ensure effective domestication, and I want to emphasize these points: domestication, compliance, and enforcement. So in terms of the harmonization, our emphasis has been on domestication, on compliance, and enforcement. And we've defined our own mechanism of monitoring so that we can report through our sectoral council, not just at what ES is doing, but as well those strategies and policies at FCTA level. And then finally on collaboration, to achieve effective implementation, again, to promote collaboration, but also I want to bring in the element of the public and private sector, because these are critical. It's not just about the secretariats engaging, but because our treaty also extends to the private sector as the engine of implementation, we ensure that we act as collaborative angle to the public sector and the private sector as well. So this perhaps collaboration aligns to cooperation within the 7. An area that we haven't, I think, emphasized as much working collaboratively with the FCTA is on best practice. We have a lot of best practice, I think, that we could bring to FCTA implementation, but the mechanisms for that need to be strengthened together with the FCTA secretariats. There's a lot that we could bring around various on customs, on rules of origin, and now we're setting a review of our own rules of origin so that we can harmonize ESC, we can harmonize the developments over the years. One of our ambitions, and this I think is a point that also Bruce made, was to create an ESC FCTA unit. And we did define that within our own strategy, whose role would be to take on those 3 responsibilities that I have highlighted, but also to assist the relevant departments within the FCTA Secretariat to track performance, to support operationalization of our technical working groups within the FCTA, and to undertake any other related activities. However, due to resource constraints, we've been able to establish this unit as had been intended. What we have done is identify critical resources within the Secretariat, but also within the partner states. We do have focal points on the FCTA, and these are our implementation arms within the partner states to triangulate and ensure that we continue to move forward. But one point of emphasis I really want to make is on the peer learning. I think there's a lot that the FCTA, the ESC could bring to the table in this regard. In terms of looping to our sectoral councils, I would in fact propose an agenda where the FCTA is taking part in our sectoral councils and presenting, putting forward any important issues just for purposes of bringing the agenda and the people closer into the room than us as the Secretariat speaking on behalf of the FCTA, having someone from the FCTA in the room with us for the sectoral council. I think that would also make a difference. In terms of relations, we do engage, we do cooperate, we do coordinate. It could be better. It could be enforced better through a program, an agenda that is very defined around particular topical issues, as we've heard from Bruce. If we tackle issue by issue, and we have these meetings where we are focused, brief, but also implement those key decisions that are made from those discussions. Again, that would help enhance the engagement and the collaboration. So with those points, I hope, Philo, I added to the discussions, to the presentations from Bruce and Faisal. I thank you.
Thanks so much, and it's given us a lot of food for thought. And for me, what clearly sticks out is the how to build this convening power with the AfCFTA Secretariat. You mentioned really good points about wanting to have more best practices, mechanisms. How do you share this? How do you share some of these examples around customs? But also a point that I think EAC and RECs are doing well is around services, because we don't only trade goods, we trade services. And I think the EAC around harmonization of qualifications and some of these examples, how can this perhaps be shared with the AfCFTA as we move into more analysis of how to implement the protocol and services on the continent? And it really raised to me a point, because you said you're focusing on coordination and collaboration. And I know that for a while, at least at the secretariat level, they had a REC coordinator who had been appointed. And maybe just to share with us your experience with how this worked. I say this because I look at a comparison with for example, peace and security at the AU, where they have liaison officers, you know, and the experience that has been shared amongst different RECs, actually it did make a difference to the collaboration. So how has been your experience, for example, with the REC coordinator at the AfCFTA?
Thank you very, very much. It's been excellent. We do have a REC coordinator based at the AU, and we as the Secretariat, our role is to make sure that we have a conduit so that there's a feedback mechanism and loop between the AU and the EA, and it has worked very well. Perhaps the latest example that I could bring to the fore is a mission from the AU that will be coming down to the Secretariat, specifically on best practices around the peace and security issues. Now, this is perhaps much broader than the discussion now because of the FCTA agenda, but from that perspective, already there's that collaboration in terms of also resource mobilization and resources back to support our peace and security agenda. So we do see the value in having that coordination role. We do see the value in that the feedback mechanisms, but we also see the value in sustaining that through meaningful conversations around issues that are important for the REC, but also for the broader agenda.
And has this, for example, also been done with the AfCFTA Secretariat? Because to my knowledge, I think they had an AfCFTA-REC coordinator before. I think they're recruiting for the role at the moment. What was your experience with the AfCFTA-REC coordinator? Was it similar to the AU?
Perhaps not in the same way. With the FCTA coordinator, we would envisage with this role fully on board that there will be better coordination with the EAC Secretariat to support our own coordination expectations. So it's perhaps it has varied, and I would understand so, given the staff resources and how vast the agenda there is to be coordinated, but also taking into consideration the extent to how far the ESC has gone in terms of, we're not going to wait for the FCTA Secretariat, for instance. We will continue to move on with our agenda because we also have an obligation to our partner states, but making sure that we're not leaving the FCTA Secretariat behind. So we endeavor to coordinate through the mechanisms that are available in place. But indeed, stronger coordination through a coordinator would add much more value.
Thanks for sharing this, Annette. I would like to move on to Elaine, but I do have some more questions, so I will come back, Annette, also just following from the discussion between what Bruce and Faisal have shared. But in the interest of time, I'll move on to Elaine. Elaine, assuming for those who are, I'm sure, familiar with her work, Elaine is awesome. But she is the Chief of Programs at the Trademark Africa, formerly Trademark East Africa. And she has a vast expertise also working on the continent in different capacities. And today she'll be sharing with us a perspective from a partner implementer perspective, you know, when it comes to the implementation of the AfCFTA. For you, Elaine, I have just a couple of questions, but maybe just to start off. As a partner in the implementation of the AfCFTA, you work through countries, but also support efforts at the regional economic community level and the AfCFTA level. How do you see the 7 levels that were presented by Bruce and Faisal in terms of regional REC AfCFTA relations? Can they help in guiding, for example, some of your interventions on what member states want to do at the national or REC level vis-a-vis what they want to do through the AfCFTA?
Thank you so much, Philo. Auntie Philo has been calling you now. And thanks to Bruce, Faisal, and Annette, who have really spoken quite well on the subject and really given very good insights. A practitioner like me, I don't know what to say or what to leave, because I think I've shared with Bruce some of my frustrations, excitements as we try to navigate our way around the continent. Trademark now has a presence, I think, in 20 countries. We have offices in 14, but we are working in 20, where we are implementing programs. And this covers most of the major RECs, East, Southern, West Africa, and in the Horn of Africa. And so you can imagine, like Faisal said, these RECs are not homogeneous. It's so easy to, it's almost like walking in a minefield, in a whole continent filled with different, you don't know whether you're stepping on someone's toes or something. And I think to just kick off my conversation, I thought I would bring in a controversial bit about the personalities. You've said so much about the theory, the practice, but you haven't talked about the personalities that drive these RECs or that other RECs. There are some RECs which people have said they're synonymous with individuals. You talk about a REC and someone says, oh, that is so-and-so, or that is so-and-so. I won't mention any, but we all know that these RECs are really the persons, the people behind that drive them, that make them happen or make them not happen. And so learning how to navigate all those intricacies, the people involved can be a bit challenging, but I must say that there are also very many opportunities. There are many people that want this thing to work and have provided a lot of support. I think to your question, Philo, for me, a lot of the conversation is on the how, and that's where we get, we get stuck into sort of the dividing the pie. This is Africa, AFC, we're trying to divide it, but the what is so critical. If we could center the conversations around the what is it we are trying to achieve? And Faisal talked about the industrial development, the regional value chains. Africa, we are a rather continent where we are only exporting 2% to the rest of the world. We are only trading 15% with ourselves, and we are asking ourselves why? With such a continent of rich, vast wealth. Right now, the whole conversation globally on batteries, lithium, that whole thing, we are the ones with all the materials. Why aren't we centering the conversation on what must we be doing? And then the how comes in to support us. Because then each REC or each AfCFTA secretariat or whatever would find its space within this whole vast demand that we have. I already said there's so much for us to deliver that if anyone just did one small part, even with us as Trademark, we know we must work with so many others to deliver on the huge demand that we have for the continent. So for me, that would be the first premise. If everyone stepped back, and I know that it's territorial, I know that the RECs have their mandates, the AfCFTA has its mandates, but if we stepped away from the how or the mandate or the powers, yes, they're there, but we focused on what must we do for Africa. I think we all share that unified purpose. It would help us to get the conversation right, and then for us to start saying, okay, if AfCFTA is doing this, what should we need to do as RECs? If the RECs are doing this, what should AfCFTA have to do? So that would be the first few issues I start. Then I would go now into the second way of the way we work, because when we started Trademark, and Annette was one of us right from the start, we focused a lot on two levels. We worked at the country level and at the REC level. It was quite challenging, and most of our fortunes, in fact, are so intertwined with the EAC over the last decade or so. We quickly recognized that the RECs are critical for setting the policy framework. I mean, we would never have gone far if the East African community hadn't passed the customs union protocol, if it hadn't had the common market protocol. We were established at the right time. These protocols were enforced. The EAC didn't know how to go about it in a sense, so we supported a lot of the establishment of the Customs Management Act in a sense, making it actually effective, working with customs authorities. We supported a lot of the institutional framework at the national level. Ministries of East Africa were set up. We worked a lot with the law harmonization processes, with the law reform commissions. We worked a lot with countries setting up the common market implementation plans, customs union plans, all that infrastructure that was needed to actually get the EAC to function. We built capacity in countries like Burundi and Rwanda that were newcomers. We built capacity in those countries to actually ascend into the EAC and engage effectively in the EAC. So for instance, in Burundi, simple things like language, with translating just border documents from English to French, French to English was so transformational in actually helping them ease into the EAC. So we worked at both a country and a national level. And that was very critical, because at the national level is where implementation works. If your countries do not, if your partner states don't have the capacity, they will not implement. But then we quickly moved into what we called a corridor approach. And I think that has been so transformational for East Africa. We worked on two critical corridors, the Northern Corridor and the Central Corridor. At that time, the Northern Corridor was traversing the EAC, but also extending into DRC, Southern Sudan, that were not part of the EAC then. And so we had to have a good neighbor policy that allowed us to work in these countries. So again, we looked at corridors beyond just being transport and trade. For us, they were transformational. They were facilitative of a new way of doing business, because you were looking at these landlocked or landlinked countries that had to depend on the coastal countries. And then you're also looking at the opportunities, because we did studies, say, with the World Bank that showed development for any of these countries is going to happen within 75 kilometers of the corridor. That's where that's why we call them economic development corridors for us. We look at it more in the economic sense of what these corridors can do to transform the prosperity of their countries. And so a lot of our work has focused on critical nodes, on points like the ports, and on corridors. And I believe if we do that approach within this AfCFTA, it will be transformational. And that's what we are trying to replicate in the other regions. In Horn of Africa, regardless of whether it's in one REC or two RECs, we are working along corridors. In Southern Africa, we are working along corridors regardless of whether they're in one REC or two RECs. Same with West Africa, we are working primarily along the Abidjan-Lagos corridor, but also with others. What does that mean? We then have to interface with both the AfCFTA Secretariat and with the RECs. At times, we have to work with more than one REC on a specific corridor, and that can be a bit challenging. So for instance, you can imagine in West Africa, we are trying to navigate with ECOWAS. I don't know if it's one of those recognized, but it's one of those we have to interact with. Then there's ECAS, which now leads into, and I know it's not recognized fully as under the, but it's one which also leads into, if you're going to tap into markets in Central Africa. And so that's the approach we are taking. That means we have to have MOUs with each of those RECs. That means we have to have relationships with each of those RECs. I spent quite a lot of my time trying to build relations and to try and ensure that we navigate those sensitivities that would otherwise block progress, because if you step on toes, you might easily be knocked out of a region or a corridor. I'll put it as bluntly as that. But good thing, we have good relations, and I think these are really supporting us to drive the relationship. Now, I talked earlier about the political will and the champions, and Annette has touched on it, Faizo has touched on it. In East Africa, with the REC itself, because of the pace of integration, we know it's very political. We know the pace is often not as fast as possible. And you can imagine at a continental level, when you try to bring consensus to 54 or 55 countries, it's not going to happen overnight. So with what we saw in East Africa, having what was then called the Coalition of the Willing and is now the National, the Northern Corridor transformation project, that was critical for us. It allowed us to gain political momentum to galvanize a whole integration process. The customs union had been in effect for 10 years or so, but the pace was so slow. By the time you get consensus, at that time East Africa was 5 countries, then 6, 7, now there are 8. Building consensus can be a challenge. However, the coalition allowed us to transform in a way that it found our technical solutions already in place. For instance, we had already put in place integrated border management at the borders. We had already put in place work with the customs unions. Then overnight you have a single customs territory in place that allows you to put in place a destination model that increases the transparency along the corridor, and then makes everyone believe, oh, we can actually trade with each other, we can actually transit goods go through and all that. For us, that political momentum was critical, and we are seeing it lacking at the continental level. The AfCFTA Secretariat is not a political animal. It is a technical secretariat. So you would expect the political momentum to either come from the partner states, again, the champions, the AUC, the AU Commission, or somewhere we need to get that political momentum to drive integration at the continental level. Even when we have the GTI and other similar projects, we all know that the biggest challenges, even as the tariffs are going down, we know that the biggest challenges are the border closures, the delays at the borders, the NTBs, many of which are either politically motivated or something. So how are we going to where is this momentum coming from? Some of my conversations with the SG are always around, where is this political strength going to come from? Who is going to have the muscle to drive this integration that the continent so needs? REC, not REC, AfCFTA and not AfCFTA, someone has to drive this. And again, it will most likely come from the partner states. So if we can get a coalition of the willing among the partner states that say, we must trade as Africa, north, south, east, west must trade, we must get it going. And I'll close on a couple of issues. For us, we've done a few studies. One of the studies we have recently done with the EAC is looking at its trade potential within the AfCFTA and finding that just within East Africa, if it traded more with Southern Africa, it would have a potential of $1.9 billion annually coming through, if it were just to unlock a few things. So you can already see a building block of the tripartite for us would allow East Africa to already realize potential benefits of up to $2 billion annually. So it's a quick win already. You have the building block of the REC, then you have RECs coming together as a tripartite, and then you have the AfCFTA. If we can try to build on these things, and it makes sense because already geographically the countries are together. You have COMESA, SADC, EAC, all together. You know the way goods move on land. You have to have that continuous free flow. So I think it would make sense to support some of these established structures that are already building on the momentum of the RECs. And the second issue we've been trying to work with, again, we have discussed this at length with the AfCFTA Secretariat, is on the inter-REC. We believe that's the added value that AfCFTA would add to this conversation. When I'm traveling across the region and you talk to leaders in different countries, so in the EAC, they're eyeing market in West Africa, though realistically, through our studies, the easiest market for the EAC right now would be Southern Africa. There's already of trade happening, so growing that potential would be possible if you unlocked a number of barriers. If you're in West Africa, they're looking at East Africa. So we are seeing where are the opportunities for inter-REC engagement, where can we build blocks? And so some of the things we've started doing is the practical things. Again, trademark is very practical. Let me give you an example, customs connectivity. So right now we are discussing with the Ghana Customs Authority and the Kenya Customs Authority, building on a bilateral that has already been put in place by the two governments to say, can we connect your customs? That will be a game changer because anyone trading from Ghana to Kenya and Kenya to Ghana will have instant access clearance. We have seen what it does. We have already done the same with Tanzania, which is in the EAC, and Malawi, which is in down south. We have already connected their customs and we're already seeing faster clearance time. So these are some of the practical approaches we are trying to do to get that conversation going of what would inter-REC actually mean. How would we support and facilitate trade within RECs? And these are the conversations we had started having, of course, with Prudence when he was on institutional partnerships. How can we use the existing inter-REC platform to move the conversation beyond whose role or whose mandate or what should we be doing to actually identifying tangible projects that can be supported across RECs that could allow free movement of goods or services, freer movement of goods or services to happen. I'll stop there. I have quite a lot in my notes here, but just know that it's very complex. But in my experience, I think it's all about relations and getting those champions who can really see that big vision and allow for Africa to trade with itself. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Elaine, for really giving us this practical example of some of the challenges that you face in your work. I mean, I liked how you started by, it's also about personalities, and that's just being honest. It is about that, sometimes to move something, you need to be able to speak to the right person to move the process. So how do we move beyond this to really, as you framed it, looking at what are we trying to achieve and how can we do that together? I like your practical examples around the inter-REC, and perhaps maybe even going back to what Elaine said, the need to share best practices. Maybe a question I'll pose to both of you is what is being done to, for example, amongst RECs, have this better peer learning and coordination? Because one of the issues during the study that was raised was sometimes beyond the one meeting, there's not so much continuous inter-REC discussions. So how are you both seeing this in your work, both at the EAC but also at TMA? You raised a number of issues around the corridor approach, some of your good experiences with it. And I know, Bruce, perhaps you can come in maybe just to really shed some political economic analysis from your work on corridors, whether you see this as a workable approach that could be used in future for the implementation. What are some perhaps things to really look out for that both the RECs and AfCFTA should be aware of, and member states, perhaps? And we're also getting questions from the chat, but maybe let me allow first for this speaker discussion, and at 15 past the hour, I can switch it over to the Q&A because we're already getting a lot of questions. So maybe first to Elaine, just to respond on this inter-REC, and then Annette, perhaps supplement, and then Bruce on the corridors, and Faisal as well.
Okay, thank you so much. So one of the reasons we were invited to work in West Africa at that time by the AfCFTA Secretariat was because of what was emerging as the best practices in East Africa. And again, I've said our fortunes are simply intertwined with the ESC. We've really worked with the ESC for the last 14 years, trying out very many things, and the corridor approach was what we thought we could prioritize in West Africa. And so working with the AfCFTA Secretariat and later ECOWAS, we started piloting what we had done in East Africa, in West Africa. But of course, one of the sayings in our corridors at work is East is not West and West is not East. So we are very cognizant of the different contexts, the different issues and all. So we are now trying to do the not no-stop borders, but one-stop border operational in West Africa. They do have the infrastructure in place in some of the places, but the integrated border management, nothing. The joint border engagement, nothing. So we are trying to see if we can replicate 24-hour working, border crossings, which in East Africa is now a norm. At most of the major border crossings, they work 24 hours. They are integrated because of the single customs territory. They sit on both sides of the border. It's really a one-stop border post in practice. I know now in East Africa, they're even already moving towards a no-stop, potentially working with the East African Secretariat, Kenya and Uganda. We are seeing if we can already put smart gates at Busia. So the Interreg can work in practice. We just need to identify those areas and those things that we can showcase. We have also done the same in the Horn of Africa. A lot of good practices around port efficiency, around regional electronic cargo tracking are already being piloted in Horn of Africa. I wouldn't even say piloted, they're already full-blown implementation. We have been there for around 4 or 5 years in the Horn of Africa. So we are trying in our own way to capture, document, and scale, taking into account the contexts in those regions. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Elaine. Annette, perhaps maybe just in a minute or so, maybe supplement some of the examples from the EAC. As we heard, perhaps SADC could be the best place to look first, but we see that there's interest to look more towards the West. What are some of these Interreg discussions that are ongoing, maybe as REC, but also flagging to AfCFTA, maybe about this?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Perhaps my first comment will be that it's very important to go back to the mandate. What is the mandate of the FCTA Secretariat, for instance? And what is the mandate of the ESC Secretariat? There is a tendency to try to mesh the two, and in the process, there seems to be perceived stumbling over each other, but that's not the case. I think the mandate for each of the RECs, including the FCTA Secretariat, is very, very clear. What is important is the coordination, and I really want to emphasize this. I'll give an example. We last had a technical meeting, coordination meeting among RECs and the FCTA Secretariat in June last year, 2023. That's when we last had a coordination meeting at technical level. And the mandate of the FCTA Secretariat is to look at implementation of FCTA protocols, annexes, trade in goods, trade in services. So if the technical meetings are not taking place, then there is an issue. The CEOs of the RECs last met in June 2022. If the CEOs of the RECs are not meeting, are not being coordinated within the framework of the FCTA Secretariat, that also is a challenge. So let's start by solving some of these issues that can be solved quickly, establish a timetable of engagement around the technical issues, around the political issues. We will be able to move forward together to address the intent of the different protocols on trade in goods to enhance intra-Africa trade. All those issues will be addressed. So I don't want to go into the technical issues because those are quite clear, how we can work, where we have made success, where we still see the gaps in logistics, in trade facilitation. Those are very clear. For me, it's the softer issues. How do we deal with the softer issues around engagement, around coordination? Because when you're not talking to each other, you're not able to understand each other and to move forward on issues that require attention. Secondly, on that's one issue. Now, on the issue of best practices, no, I wanted to go back to the tripartite because I think it is linked to an issue I have seen a number of people comment on. Again, the biggest challenge that I see with the tripartite ESC, COMESA, SADC is a lack of a secretariat. So this is an evolving mechanism. It is with SADC. It is falling on my lap soon as a summit takes place. And then I'll have to deal with it for a year, and then I'll pass it on. No ping pong. It is not going to be meaningful unless the tripartite is buttressed by a secretariat with a mandate. And again, we can talk about what we see as RECs so that it can be coordinated the framework of the tripartite. Again, the harmonization. We are going to go back to exactly the same issues as we're trying to deal with if we don't try to understand, and this should be a learning point, engagement between RECs and the FCTA for purposes of how then the tripartite could even work better to coordinate the work of the RECs to lead to dealing with the challenges around overlapping membership. I will stop there, Philo.
Thanks so much, Annette. In fact, I had flagged to ask you about the tripartite, but good call to speak about it in your intervention. And indeed, we need to sort of, I think, look at the bigger picture, how to prevent getting back to the same start position when it comes to this inter-REC vis-a-vis AfCFTA implementation. And the TFTA, for example, is a good way to already have 3 RECs quite able to discuss amongst themselves, be it around rules of origin, be it around issues around harmonization, SPS, TBT that Faizo mentioned earlier. So this could be a good starting point. I wanted to bring in Bruce a little bit before I open up the Q&A, just to comment on the corridors aspect that was raised and how this approach could be one that perhaps both the RECs and AfCFTA work on together, but also just bring in the realities of what it, from the findings of the corridor work, some things that we should be already flagging early in terms of cooperation.
Yep. Thank you very much. I mean, in a way, this is all of these things are interconnected, of course, and it's fascinating to hear the way Alain's talking about trying to navigate this stuff as trademark, and then obviously Alain now talking about the ping pong of TFTA being sort of landing on your lap. And I think, so the way that this was also through the study, the point was to say, there are these institutional angles, and I think the more that there's a risk in a way of becoming paralyzed, because this sort of, as we always talk about, the spaghetti bowl of overlapping memberships does create these additional kind of administrative burdens. And it seems to me that in a way that these are seen as a negative, and the question would be, is it a way to see them as a positive? So I can understand it might be easier to have a TFTA sort of secretariat, but would that not just add in another kind of layer of complexity in amongst all of these issues? And I guess the point would be, what could be drawn on them for, I mean, if we think the CFTA, Alain was saying, what are we trying to do? That is good, actually. We always talk about how, but what actually sometimes is still good to remember. So I mean, I think if the what really is this AfCFTA ambition, then even the TFTA, the tripartite, should be kind of just a subset in a way of the wider AfCFTA. Now, for me, since you asked about the corridors, for me, I mean, again, Alain is the one who's best placed to talk about this in the real practice. But for us, what has been interesting is it's almost, to my mind, it's almost the sort of the opposite end of the spectrum from the institutional angle. So everything we've been talking about is in a way being sort of top down from these framings at a continental level, from a regional level. And the corridors are essentially where all of these things come together, where the regional agreements, the continental agreements, the private sector, the customs officers, the officials, the informal traders, everybody sort of comes together then around these corridors. So in a way, for me, that's why also in the paper, we were saying, instead of getting sort of lost or paralyzed with the trying to come up with some clear institutional framework for all of this, is more, what would be some of the bottom-up ways of doing this? So one would be corridors, another would be specific value chains. That's a conversation that I know that Faizo we've had as well, about if you pick some specific value chains that have been targeted as the AfCFTA, maybe that's also a way to kind of bring in the institutional angles where it most makes sense. And the third one, which is more the focus of the paper, was on specific protocols. And I think somebody already said maybe some of the RECs could actually be championing specific protocols and basically taking a lead there, which what I know from experience is SADC, for example, in its previous SADC with 2 Cs, had actually allocated different member states as sort of a role to champion specific aspects of the regional agenda. And I often wonder if that's something that we could actually be trying to do to try and help push through this AfCFTA agenda. But if we go back to the corridors in particular, I think they are, in a way, the culmination of all of these continental regional policies on the ground, and it's ultimately the traders and especially trading goods, at least, is moving along these. But I think from our work, which in a way builds a bit on trademark and all these, the corridors are also very different. So the Maputo corridor we looked at, there was a lot of this. It was a bit like what Alain was saying, a coalition of the willing. The Maputo corridor too. What we've looked at other corridors, the Beira corridor and the Cala corridor in Mozambique, you don't have that coalition. It's quite different. And so what you see is that these things are actually changing depending on who's driving and depending what the underlying interest is. And I think for me, I would have two questions a little bit because they're on the top, they're hot topics at the moment. One is the Lobito corridor is discussed a lot. But I hear about it a lot because it's been signaled by the European Union as a sort of a priority corridor under their global gateway. Of course, there's a historical corridor there, there's a railway line, but I wonder to what degree there is this sort of underlying ambition and political desire from the member states and the private sector there. So if we think of Maputo or the Northern Corridor, are there any of those drivers there for something like the Lobito Corridor? And maybe we don't want to be too provocative, I wonder even in the Abidjan-Lagos Corridor, to what degree that's really driven by a sort of an underlying demand to see this move. Is this a response, perhaps, to the ECOWAS exits? I've seen it being framed a little bit like that. But we know that most of the real trade is kind of going north to south. And I think when we go back a bit to Alain's point about A, individuals, and B, coalitions of willing, I guess the point would be, for this AfCFTA thing more broadly, and for the corridors more specifically, where is the real, in a way, it's about identifying where the real sort of champions and interests are. Where are the economic opportunities that are going to actually grow from this? And that's where I think we would begin to see implementation and maybe more of a sort of almost a demand for AfCFTA implementation.
Thanks so much, Bruce, for sharing this. And indeed, it's just, you rightly pointed out, where are these interests, where did they lie? And perhaps maybe before I turn to the Q&A phase, I want to bring you in a little bit here to also give you a perspective, because Bruce has focused on the corridors, but we do know that another aspect which we look at in our paper is around the value chains. And the AfCFTA does have this objective to create value chains, to have more value addition on the continent. Do you see the same challenges perhaps in the identification and who leads what with your work around textiles? Is this best done at the REC level and then scaled up the AfCFTA, or must the AfCFTA have sort of unification and sort of guide how it should be implemented continental-wide? Maybe just some insights around value chains in 2 or 3 minutes, and I'll open up to the Q&A. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Philomena. I think that's a really good question. I really like the discussion about the drivers of integration. And, in the EAC, I think the work of Trademark Africa is really using the corridors and the logistics chains to drive, the integration project. And you've identified some of the critical nodes, as you called it, and certainly in the Horn, you can see the port there was crucial for getting trade to move. So that's one of the drivers. But I think the other driver must be the value chains. They have to be the value chains. But why? Because we have to find a way for countries on the continent to build industrial capabilities and to use their comparative advantage, whatever they have, and help each other to create value. It's about cooperation with each other to increase value added and competitiveness, and to also in this way attract investment, both regional and global investment. They won't come, the investors, unless we are able to take the initiative to build a cooperation. So we have identified one such sector, that's the cotton, fiber, textile, apparel value chain, all the way through to the retailers on the African continent. So sometimes in these value chains, you can drive them from the top. You can drive them from the market. And in fact, in textiles, a lot of the value chains that globally are driven by the retailers. So retailers can play a big role. But countries, in the private sector working in apparel can start looking for the textile producers, because in most cases on the continent, we import the textiles from outside the continent. And one of the key challenges for us is to transform the huge advantage we have in cotton. We have plenty of cotton on the continent. We just don't transform it into fiber and textiles here in Africa. We export it, raw to other parts of the world. So there's a great opportunity here on the African continent to collaborate. And this project has started. There is currently, after over 2 years of work, a collaboration between over 20 business associations from Mauritius and Madagascar to South Africa to Lesotho and Kenya, Nigeria, but also including Morocco and Egypt. So quite a lot of discussion underway. And this is going to give us a great opportunity, bringing the private sector in as drivers of the value chain on the African continent, and a great experience. So I hope that we find the resources and the support, because it needs a bit of resources to maintain the momentum to create the value chain. And once that momentum has developed, it will take a life of its own, and it will start encouraging investors. So that's one sector. Of course, this can be replicated in other sectors, like the automotive sector, the critical mineral sector, agri-processing, pharmaceuticals. So these are all potential areas for the continent. And once you start building the value chain, then you come up with the non-tariff barriers. Then people say, well, what about SPS? What about TBT? We need to harmonize. We need to, and then the RECs. And I like this idea about the inter-REC coordination, because maybe we start with 2 RECs, that haven't been trading with each other, like the EAC and the SADC regions. And then through that experience, if you can connect that with a value chain and the corridors, you will then begin to get experience. So I've just put this out there as another driver for regional integration that we still have to explore together on the continent. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Faizo, for this. And indeed, with the work that you're doing around textiles, I think this would be sort of a good pilot for some of the other value chains that have been sort of flagged for the continental development. I like the point that you also really honed in about the inter-REC, and it reminds me of a corridor conversation I once had with somebody about perhaps the GTI could have taken a more REC approach instead of country. So why can it not be scaled up to be REC by REC under the GTI, and perhaps see how this could be made to foster more inter-REC trade, but also, ultimately more intra-African trade. We have a couple of questions. I see a lot of excited chatter in our chat box. Some are comments, some of course the questions. I think the first that was raised was around the TFTA. Elaine, to an extent, and also Annette spoke about this. Maybe I'll just ask it broad, and then you can see if you want to supplement this question. It was from Beru Lako. I can also allow people to ask the questions themselves, because we have 30 minutes. But if you want me to read it, I can also read it out. It's fine. Auntie Philo is very flexible with this moderation. So the question goes, would it be prudent to push for more engagements under the tripartite on regional inter-REC integration towards a bigger AfCFTA development, since currently the REC integration is still poor? think this would go to Annette and Elaine. And then I'll take maybe two questions. There was a comment from Ziad who's saying that sharing a thought from an academic group's deliberations regarding AfCFTA relations. In the exceptional cases where countries change REC membership for whatever reason, for example, the AES countries leaving ECOWAS soon, the AfCFTA provides an additional reason for the need to continue to harmonize regional and continental implementation of trade to provide a buffer against potential disruptions. Do the speakers agree with this viewpoint? Perhaps you can say something about this. and then I'll take the last one and then let you respond before the next set. From Mr. Pierre, we have the AfCFTA came into effect over 5 years ago. What are some of the success stories in the AfCFTA? Is it regional cooperation leading to actual changes in the ease of intra-African trade? Perhaps in your work, do you see this? Or is there still more skepticism? And perhaps what can be done to foster this better? Thanks. So I'll open up on the TFTA question firstly, Annette, and then Elaine, and then allow also Bruce and Basil to comment on the others.
Okay, thank you very much. And it was whether we shouldn't push more on the inter-REC through the tripartite. And indeed, yes, why not? Because the more we can harmonize as the three RECs, then that provides a very good and strong foundation for the FCTA. But just think about the practicalities, which is what we are discussing on this call. What are the practicalities of that harmonization process, and what do you need to be able to be successful? Because the intent, the ambition is very clear. The goals are very well aligned towards harmonization, but how do you make it happen? How do you make it happen? For me, that's the issue. You need resources, you need the technical expertise working well together, and you need them to be coordinated. And that's why earlier I emphasized that it's very important that we do have that mechanism that is sustainable for purposes of that coordination. It could be a secretariat, it could be a longer mandate for the REC that is managing the agenda for that duration, not necessarily just a year, because a year passes by too quickly. When you're starting to coordinate the other RECs, you're already moving on to pass the baton to the next REC. And it doesn't really support that sustainability. I also wanted to comment briefly, if you allow, on the value chains, because that's a very, very critical issue for the ESC as well. We've already identified ESC value chains that we are promoting. These are aligned to the FCTA value chains on motor vehicle assembly, textiles and apparel, pharmaceuticals, agribusiness. They're all very well aligned. And what are we doing at the ESC? For example, on the vehicle and the vehicle assembly, already our trade policies promote building of our auto industry. If you look at our city, for instance, on parts, if you look at rules of origin, allowing for assembly in the region, we already are trying within our current trade policy to promote the motor vehicle industry. But what we are now working towards is how do we connect the ESC industry to the other broader auto industry within Africa? That is the question and the challenge that we put ourselves forward for. And we've established a platform for motor vehicle assemblers. They are going to start engaging as a private sector towards this goal. Also on textiles and apparel, we are establishing a platform for this purpose, and I'd be very keen perhaps to follow this up together with our teams working on productive sectors to see how do we join these efforts. Because as Faisal said, it needs resources, it needs technical expertise, capacity building as well, including the private sector. So there was another, I'm sorry, I'm coming, maybe then you won't have to come back to me if I speak to all these issues. Somebody did raise an issue on whether the guided trade initiative should have been between RECs. But remember, at the ESC, as I said, we were already ahead. We have a simple trade regime already that we had. So we've now tried to align our simplified trade regime, see how that links into the guided trade initiative, so that we're not looking at just trade amongst the ESC countries, but how does the simplified trade regime support the trade initiative as well? So there's that alignment as well that's happening. Again, going back to those 7 issues that were raised on harmonization and how the ES is trying to embed the FCTA processes into ESC practice. I thank you.
Thanks so much, Annette, for sharing this. Really, just at least some of what practical examples EAC is really taking into its mandate and what it needs to connect better to the continental level. Perhaps, Elaine, if you can supplement on the TFTA from a practitioner's level, some of the issues you see around this, some of the ways forward.
Yeah, I don't want to put my foot in it because you can't say one is better than the other. I mean, there are all these structures that are there, they are serving different purposes. Again, for me, it comes back, as everyone has been saying, to coordination in practice. But we also know, if you look at the trends of trade, where is trade happening? Who is trading? What are the pathways they're using to trade? So if you look, for instance, at a country like Uganda, landlocked, its biggest trading partners, looking at its data, are its next door neighbors. It's the DRC. At first, it was re-exposed to South Sudan, it's Kenya, and then of course it goes further afield to the Middle East, Asia, India, and the like. So if you're looking at where people are trading most, the natural path would be your neighbors, and then you keep growing outward. The natural path, because it's easier to move your produce. If you're doing your onions, you move them to the next door, you buy their beans or whatever it is. So I would imagine that tripartite makes a lot of sense, in a sense that things are, concentrated around. For East Africa's trade potential, as we have said, a lot of it is within that southern region, within COMESA, within SADC, because already people are trading. If you look at the horticulture exporters here in, say, Uganda, Kenya, after the EU, a lot of them are moving towards South Africa, where the market has proven itself to be quite solid for East Africa's fruits, horticulture produce, and there's also the purchasing power. Of course, we've heard of, say, countries like Uganda saying, oh, we've gotten a market for powdered milk, say, in Morocco. But looking at the volumes needed, looking at the transportation, it also poses its challenges, yet it's a good opportunity. So now looking at the economies of scale, looking at how you can aggregate. So I don't want to say one is better than the other, but there are opportunities that can be exploited. And I think for me, if those conversations were held in the inter-REC, say, conversation, and for instance, if we talked about a value chain like Faisal has talked about, say, the CTG, cotton textile garments, and then you're looking at where the pathways are for that sector to grow, that value chain to grow, you make sense. So one example I could give where we're trying to navigate is with a program we have started with the AfCFTA Secretariat on fish value chain. We got a grant from MasterCard to impact tens of thousands of fishing communities and try and see how we can support the continent to become more self-sustaining in the fish sector. And so we're working small island states, big producing states, big importing states, and we have identified around 6 to 11 countries that are going to benefit across the continent. It's going to be one of the first value chain programs, in essence, where we try to look at not just the demand and supply of the fish, but the related infrastructure and related outputs around it. So, for instance, fish oil, fish seed, and that kind of thing. We are also trying a couple of other value chains within the eastern region on cotton textile garments. It's easier if you look at the cotton producing countries, Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, Tanzania, and then you look at the capacity to manufacture within those countries. So for instance, Kenya, and it already also has access to a Goa market, it becomes a natural hub for you to then center all the industries towards either the purchasing towards Kenya, but you're also building the other lower level industrial capacity within the other countries. For instance, for the lint or for thread or buttons or whatever to make sure that they're supplying that chain. So we are thinking through some of these issues. It's not easy, but as I said, I don't think I can give you one is better than the other answer.
Thanks so much, Elaine. No, this already shed some light on what is being done, for example, to develop within this inter-REC system some value chains that could maybe be scaled up through AfCFTA. I see our participants are wanting to ask their questions. Wumi, I see you made a comment, but I would like to give you the floor. So please unmute yourself, put your video on, we can see your lovely face, and feel free to ask your question.
Okay. Good afternoon from Abuja. Thank you very much. And good for this kind of educative program, and I really enjoy all the discussion. But I just want to lend my voice to the issue on grants. Some of them may be contribution, and some of them may be some kind of suggestion. Because when I look at this, I think our major focus here is how to make the AfCFTA and regional integration support the continental trade. And that's where I want to focus on. And based on our kind of little experience that we have at a regional body, I think there are some things that we really need to have some kind of critical thinking about that. Mainly, to me, with all these beautiful discussions that we have, I think we are now moving from theoretical part to practical side, which I believe, in which now AfCFTA has come to stay. The regional economic communities, they are there to stay. But now, how can we now make the use of these two institutional arrangements to promote trade? One, what I just want to see is that, you see, unless we find means to promote what I can call purposeful complementarity instead of competition, if we can find a device, platform, in which we can have the complementarity between the AfCFTA and other regional economic community that we think of, whether recognized by AU or not AU, on a purposive platform, I think that would be a very, very good idea. And what do I mean like that? I believe that the REC should not see themselves as being competing with the AfCFTA. As we all know, the scope of REC is wider compared to AfCFTA. So, but that aspect of the regional economic community that can be able to support the effort of the AfCFTA is an issue that we really need to really discuss. One, our regional economic community, somebody has discussed this one, they are not homogeneous. They are of different sizes, they are of different scope, they were created at different time. So me, I don't see them as a building blocks. What we now need to do is that what that aspect of the regional economic community that you can be able to use to promote the regional, the continental trade. So that's why I believe that we should be focusing more on program and project implementation using the RECs and the AfCFTA platform, instead of putting a lot of thought on this collaboration, on institutional arrangement, and so on and so forth. And somebody has said it all. If we take value chain now, can we have a continental value chain in which what will be the role of RECs, what will be the role of AfCFTA? So if you take the rules of origin, at ECOWAS level now, we have the E certificate of origin, in which I don't know the electronic one now. At least ECOWAS is ahead along that line. But how can we be able to take advantage of that with other regional economic community? What lesson can AfCFTA learn from that? We have the SIGMAT on the transit. And so also we have the simplified trade regime, complementing GTI at the EAC level. What lesson can other RECs be able to do that? So please, if we can be able to take program by program, project by project, and then we move on, not to be thinking of this bogus arrangement, like all these RECs, all this AfCFTA, all this kind of institutional arrangement. If we begin to do that, we will be using all the period for negotiation, for meetings, and so on and so forth, instead of promoting trade. In any case, production of it for trade, production is very, very important. How can we use a system to promote production through value chain? That is what I think should be our focus in this kind of deliberation. And then another thing that I'll be thinking of is the fact that when we are talking about the implementation of different kind of trade instruments, whether we have at the RECs or at the AfCFTA level, especially with respect to continental trade, what are we doing with respect to the monitoring and evaluation? The issue now is that by now we should realize that country level data may not be useful in assessing the performance of all these kind of trade regimes that we have. Why we now need to focus on industry level? What are we putting in place to get the industry level data, industry level statistics, so that each REC can be able to monitor and evaluate what is the benefit of the AfCFTA trade regime to each member state or to the region. And from that, we can produce a lot of intelligence reports, because let me tell you something, the best way for you to introduce any new product is if you can be able to see it as a success story. If you can see a lot of trade promotion, trade development in all these our various things, you will see majority of this regional economic community, everybody will align, because they will say there's a mutual benefit. But even the benefit we are deriving from any kind of trade regime we have, can we be able to monitor? Can we be able to measure them? Do we even have the data set to be able to do that? Do we create the platform for business integration? How can we integrate business in Nigeria with Togo, with Senegal, with South Africa, with all of them? Do we even have a platform for business to know each other? How many business know each other within the region? So that is some of those things that I want us to, please let us find a way to be able to do that. Then we any kind of collaboration or something we have, we need to talk about how do we set agenda and so on and so forth. That is my own thinking. Thank you very much.
No, thank you so much for sharing this. You've shared really practical examples, but I think some of our participants don't know you. I know you personally, so maybe just a few seconds to say who you are.
Okay, thank you. My name is Wumi Olaiwola. I'm a Principal Program Officer in the Directorate of Research and Statistics in the Department of Economy Affairs and Agriculture, ECOWAS Commission, Abuja. Thank you.
Thank you, Wumi. And thank you for also sharing the perspective of ECOWAS. And I can see from the chart that Alain has shared that also they're working on the certificate of origin. So perhaps already existing mechanisms that you were mentioning, how can we be more practical? Perhaps this is a way to work also with TMA to see how can this be scaled, continental-wide. This issue around data, of course, is very critical because we need the right data to make the right decisions. So thank you for flagging this. I also had another hand that was raised. Bitrina, if you want to ask your question.
Yes, I want.
Introduce yourself as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to add my voice. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to attend this very important gathering. My name is Bitrina Diamet from Tanzania. I work for Science, Technology, Innovation Policy Research Organization. I think Bruce, we met in Nairobi, if I remember quite well. Yeah, I should say that I'm not an expert on trade. I know trade as much as it relates to development as it relates to innovation, because trade is very important for innovation. So that is how I know it. I think we all agree that the Pan-African continental free trade is very important. I mean, everybody's saying, and it's actually being said everywhere, even in the written work. The challenge seems to be how to implement it. How do we implement, especially because of the existence of RECs? And there are, I read the paper, I think a number of times. It's a very interesting paper, but things seems to be very complicated. And my addition is to how I think we could address that complexity. I think I looked at the 8 things. It's 8 or 10 ways of addressing. You had unity, harmonization, and I think I'll go for harmonization. And how do we now practically operationalize harmonization? I think it's very important, and I think you also had this proposal in your paper that the Pan-African trade has to have an objective, clearly stated objective that is actually very, very attractive to everybody in Africa. The countries, the RECs, and the African Union, it has to be. And then you have a strategies on how to implement that Pan-Africa. Leave alone, don't even talk at what is happening at the RECs level. just forget, because it's very complicated. They are very different. So don't look at them. Just focus on how can we address this objective that we have stated? What will be the strategies? And once we all agree on the strategies, then we go back to RECs, every REC, to make sure that what they are doing is not antagonistic to what we have all agreed, including themselves. So, and I think that way it will be possible, because if they are allowed, RECs will be allowed to do whatsoever of their own that is not in conflict with what we have agreed as a region, then they should go ahead. If it is in conflict and they agreed on the objective and the strategies, they have to, it has to be harmonized. I want to mention two things that I think is of particular interest for the whole of Africa. And I think Africa can have, through the continental free trade, can have a unified voice and action against unfair terms of trade. It's there. I have been reading. And if I could just quickly mention something, there is this Europe, what they say is about carbon border adjustment mechanism. There is law on deforestation. And all this is somehow trying to ban export, because Africa is trying to industrialize, is trying to create employment for its people. Poor people, 60% of poor people are in Africa. And Africa do not have capabilities to transit into green right now. They have potential, a lot of potential, but not now. So I feel it's like it's unfair. So Africa can deal with that.
Petrina, I'll just give you one more minute, and then I have to take some.
Okay. Yes, they have to kind of trade among themselves. Whatsoever the trade maybe is banned for export, and then let Africa trade those things, especially those that are being processed in the continent. This is one, to trade through tariffs, they can do that. But the second thing, within one minute, is to make sure that Africa is rich in natural resources, to make sure Africa's natural resources are used first. Of course, the rest of the world also deserve that. First, for the Africa's development. What I mean is that African natural resources, and this has been said by my colleagues, has to be processed within Africa. It has to be processed within Africa. You can have, if the capability is not there, local, then you have kind of foreign investment. If there are incentives, if it is free trade, then you can invite investment from outside.
Okay, thank you so much.
1 minute. But what I'm saying is that Africa, and nobody is saying this, Africa needs to build capabilities for science, technology, and innovation, because without that, they cannot do what I have just said. And finally, everybody has said political will. Political will is the only problem, nothing else. Political will has to be there, and African Union has got a role
Thank you so much, Petrina. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. You raised really good points around the political will, around the need for science technology, because even the example that Elaine mentioned about the Nostro borders, that will rely a lot on technology. So how is the continent already moving towards this whole integration that is also digitally enabled to be able to trade amongst ourselves? So from the interventions, I've heard two interesting points. Wumi's point around the cost purposeful complementarity and not competition. And Petrina has raised the issue around harmonization. So with the study, we did have the 7 layers, and perhaps maybe I will give the speakers just half a minute each to comment on what they heard. Maybe before I do this, I see one last person has raised their hand. This will be the last question since time is running out. David?
Good morning from Geneva. My name is Junior Davis. I'm from UNCTAD, Director for the Policy Analysis and Research branch in the Division for Africa. I only heard about the meeting yesterday evening, so I'm afraid I didn't have a chance to read the background document, but I enjoyed the presentation of it and the discussions that have followed. Just to be brief, I just wanted to chip in on one of the issues raised. I think it was the point that Faisal mentioned, I think it's becoming increasingly important for the AfCFTA and the REC to try and target specific value chain development, because I think that is a way actually of bringing in the regional institutions. And just to offer a few suggestions that we've been thinking about at the REC level. For example, can RECs, for example, develop regional financing funds so that we can address some of the trade and regional supply chain financing that SMEs and micro SMEs need to tackle the issues of low access to affordable credit, which stifles the development of these chains. In your report, you talk a little bit about partnership development, the need to strengthen collaboration. I would have liked to have seen a little bit more emphasis on the role of regional development banks in that, and private sector, financial institutions, fintech companies. There are tools that can be used increasingly to improve access to working capital finance for SMEs and micro SMEs. And again, this helps to push and drive integration through the private sector and regional value chain development. And just briefly, I've just mentioned two other things. Digital platform utilization. I think that's becoming increasingly important. And it's something that's also been discussed a lot here in Geneva at the WTO. And there are new digital platforms being launched which connect SMEs with buyers and suppliers, supply chains. It can potentially enhance productivity and competitiveness. And I was just wondering whether, is there any work going on? And maybe our colleague from EAC can answer this. But there's any work going on at the moment at the REC level at creating regional e-commerce platforms that can showcase local SME products and services that can reach beyond, potentially beyond the region.
Is the last point?
My last point is just, we don't talk enough about business-to-business matchmaking opportunities for pan-continental private sector firms. And I think we should also do that. I'll stop there. It's a very rich discussion. It's quite wide-ranging. It's a whole bunch of things I could have mentioned, but I'll stop there. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Davis, for this intervention. And indeed, you have raised the critical issue of financing, and this was already mentioned. How do we raise finances to implement this project at the REC level, at the continental level, and what is being done? So we are 4 minutes to the hour, and we'll have 4 speakers. So I'll be very Dutch about this and give everybody 1 minute to give the final interventions. Annette, I think specifically a question was asked around what is the EAC doing around these regional platforms. Perhaps maybe you can answer that. And maybe in your final thoughts, just give us 1 or 2 points about what you think should be a priority for the AfCFTA-REC coordination meetings for the next one at least.
Okay, thank you. Gosh, I was trying to turn on my video, but it. So on the first, maybe I'll start with the last. There was a slide, I think it was one of the last slides from Bruce, which tried to map out where the across there's different areas each of the either the RECs or the FCTA secretariat would best be suited to impact. And I think it's a very, very important slide. And perhaps that would be the first discussion. Should we have an inter-REC FCTA secretariat discussion to try and digest that a bit more? Because the purpose of this discussion was to look at the FCTA and RECs and how do we work together towards implementation? Because in the end, it is the implementation that we are all targeting. So one is for us to try and understand, taking into account our various mandates, capabilities, resources, what can we best influence? For me, that's an important discussion. We haven't had that as inter-RECs coordinated by the FCTA. The question on whether RECs are the building blocks for the FCTA perhaps would be answered if we have that discussion. I would also propose that we take a more focused approach around some of these technical issues and try to discuss them to try and address the broader development issues, because this conversation has also digressed into some of the more challenges and development issues around trade, Africa, value chains. Those are conversations we need to have as RECs together with the AfCFTA Secretariat, so that again we can focus on implementation. There was a question, I think it was from Davis, the last one, on whether we have regional e-commerce platforms as RECs, for instance. And yes, we do as the EFC, and we'll be happy to share that. Thank you.
Thank you. And then I will follow with Elaine.
I won't repeat what Annette has said. I mean, we have said a lot in the conversation. I think there's a lot of opportunity for each of them within their varying mandates to play a key role. We've talked about coordination in action, but I think, as we have said here, if we can just see the what it is that we want to deliver, which is trade for Africa, the trade potential and the trade benefits for Africa, then we would all concentrate all our efforts in getting that to work. And I believe the corridors can deliver for us in that promise, plus the work we have started working on actually looking at value chains in practice. For us, that's where we are heading. And as we do so, we take a differentiated approach as long as we can see who will help get us there. At times it's a bilateral approach like we have done with Ghana and Kenya, or Malawi and Tanzania, or it's a country approach where we really dig in at the country level like we are doing in Cote d'Ivoire, or it's a REC approach within the corridors we're working, or the continental approach. So we are taking a varied approach and using whatever we can see driving the point home to help us move forward. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Elaine. Faisal, I'll give you a minute as well.
Thank you so much. Well, I really enjoyed the discussion, and I think that perhaps the starting point to move the process forward in the relationship between the AfCFTA and the RECs is to get this joint mutual understanding about what is the way forward, what is the best way forward to implement effectively the AfCFTA, how to prioritize the key strategies of the AfCFTA, and how the RECs can coordinate with the Secretariat. So that seems to me like a priority discussion. And of course, one of the issues they need to discuss is what are the main drivers? What are the main drivers for the implementation? And as I said, in my view, one of the main drivers is the value chains, but we have to agree on which ones do we prioritize and how do we work together, collaborate to implement that. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Faisal. And I will give the floor then to Bruce.
No, I mean, I want to be very brief, but I think the regional value chain, the sectors angle for sure is one that we need to look more into. And it's good to hear mention of CRMs or natural resources, green industrialization, the financing point. The second one on the corridors, we'll continue to look at those as these implementing sort of strategies, let's say. But just on the institutions, it was nice from Annette that we'd be very open basically to seeing how to put some of this on the agenda between the RECs. It seems to me that if we can find a way to kind of begin to bring this into those AfCFTA-REC coordination meetings, that actually might be a way to help sort of divide up the pie and sort of in a way allocate roles. I mean, ultimately, this is going to be messy, multi-speed, multi-actor, multi-sector, multi-level. And I think it's just finding entry points. And along these, I think that's going to be a helpful way to go. So we're very happy to continue the conversation and try and help feed into those different initiatives that you're the ones actually leading. We're observers, but it's always very interesting to engage. So thank you very much for the discussion, everybody.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks to the amazing speakers. You know, we really shared really good insights, really practical insights. To also the participants, you know, sharing their own experiences, even asking the right questions, you know, that can be considered in the implementation. As we mentioned, the study is available on the ECDPM website for those of you who want to have further reading of it, to see how really the 7 identified levels of AfCFTA-REC relations can be implemented in practice. For my side, it has been an honor being the moderator of this panel. I've learned a lot also, and it's been good to keep you know, it's been a big task because the topic is quite wide, but trying to really bring it to see how practically can we make this AfCFTA work for Africa, for the Africa that we want. And I don't take it for granted that you joined today. It's a week before Christmas, so I thank you for tuning in, for being with us discussion. And perhaps we can add to our wish list the implementation of the AfCFTA towards the dream that Africans want to be able to trade, to be able to create jobs through value addition, and just to have more prosperity on the continent. I thank you all. And this recording will be shared with the participants, will also be available on the ECDPM page. And once again, I thank you and wish you all a lovely festive season. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Faisal. Thanks, Alain.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, Wumi.
Bye.
Bye, Bruce.
Cheers, thank you.